Thank you everyone for joining us today for our AGU AGI Heads and Chairs webinar. My name is Leila Gonzalez, and joining us today, we also have Pranoti Asher, who's the Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU, Eva Kostu, who's the Program Manager for the AGU Bridge Program, and then Christopher Keene is also sitting with us, Director of Geoscience Profession and Higher Education here at the American Geosciences Institute with me. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pranoti.
All right, thanks, Leila. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to have 3 panelists today who are going to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to so many of you who work with graduate students. So first of all, we have Dr. Mike Verostek, who is a postdoctoral research in the School of Physics and Astronomy at the College of Science at Rochester Institute of Technology. His research basically is in the area of physics education research. Dr. Ben Zwickl is an associate professor in the same department, and he also co-directs the Center for Advancing Scholarship to Transform Learning at RIT, and he works on a multitude of projects to improve the quality and the accessibility of physics education for all students. Not joining us, unfortunately, today is Dr. Casey Miller, who is a Senior Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs, also at RIT, and a colleague of Mike and Ben's. He has he's very recognized. You may recognize his name from previous webinars, but he's recognized for all the transforming a lot of the work on recruitment and admission and retention to increase access and inclusion of students in STEM fields. So with that, take it away, Mike, and we're excited to hear what you and Ben have to say.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming to hear us talk about some of our work that's all about investigating graduate student perspectives on sort of the importance of and also the difficulty of finding a research group in grad school. So this presentation is sort of a summary of some of the key results across a few of the papers we've written on this topic. It's in the context of physics graduate education, but they really honestly have implications across any discipline that has similar advising structures to physics. So I'll have links to those papers also at the end of the talk. So with that, let's get started. So a commonly cited issue in STEM doctoral education is the high rate at which students leave their programs. There actually isn't a lot of great data on exactly how many students leave their doctoral programs, and estimating attrition rates isn't easy. But one of the best studies on the topic was done in about 2008 by the Council of Graduate Schools, and they estimate that attrition rates for STEM doctoral programs are around 40%. That number varies by subdiscipline. So like the attrition rate within mathematical and physical sciences is estimated to be a little higher, around 45%. This rate is even higher for traditionally underrepresented students in STEM. A follow-up study in 2015 by the same folks at the Council of Graduate Schools found that the 10-year completion rate for traditionally underrepresented students in math and physical sciences was under 50%, so less than half finished their programs. So how does this relate to our talk? Well, one of the things that's known about attrition is that students most commonly leave during the first 2 years of their program. And as far as this study is concerned, that's important because finding a research group is one of the major events that occurs during the first 2 years of someone's graduate program. So there's some reason to think that maybe that process plays a part in students' decisions to stay or leave. Now, it's already well established in the literature that advisors play kind of a critical role, right, in students' doctoral experience. And if you've gone through a PhD yourself, you know that that's a true statement. The quality of an advising relationship is known to motivate students to stay or leave. As one study really succinctly puts it, advisors can sort of make or break a PhD student. And like I said, that's all well established, but this actually leaves like a major gap in the literature on doctoral advising. And that has to do with existing research pretty much only exclusively focuses on what makes for a productive mentorship in pre-existing advising relationships. Like it assumes that relationship already exists. Very little is known about how those partnerships form in the first place. And a student's ability to navigate that advisor selection process and get into a satisfying research group could be one of the factors that influences their decision to stay or leave, as well as just have a satisfying graduate school experience overall. But that advisor search process looks different depending on the academic discipline. For instance, the idea of like rotating through labs during the first year, where students work with a few advisors during the first year before sort of settling on one, that's more common in say like biology or medicine. So for this talk, let me quickly describe how the advisor selection process works in the context of physics, where our study was conducted. And that'll hopefully frame the results we present in a way that'll be helpful for you and thinking about how you can apply some of your findings to your own local context. So here's your group of prospective physics graduate students working hard on their senior year undergraduate courses, and maybe a subset of them decide that they want to go to graduate school and get a physics PhD. The first step in that process is the application and getting admitted to grad school, right? And there are a lot of factors that influence where students apply: location, prestige, application fees, program policies, like whether they still require the physics GRE. And then obviously there's the kind of research the school does. And some students apply to school with a really strong idea of like exactly what advisor they want to work with, but others don't, right? So there's a spread there. Next, students actually arrive at the program. And at that point, usually most of the guidance they get is basically the program says in an orientation, probably like start thinking about who you might want to do research with. And again, some students probably already have a pretty good idea of who they want to work with, but a lot of others don't. But either way, really quickly after arriving to graduate school, coursework hits, right? And suddenly that's like the most important thing on everyone's mind. But in the midst of that coursework and adjusting the new department and the new city and all that, students are expected to take this first year to do things like talk to possible advisors, talk to graduate students, find out who has funding, who's a good advisor to work for, talking to other grad students. It's also really common in physics, particularly for departments to have like a first year research seminar where prospective advisors kind of come in and give a talk about their work to first year graduate students. So those are sort of the main ways the students are supposed to figure out who they want to work with. And that whole process is supposed to be carried out over the course of the first year, at the end of which students are kind of expected to join a research group. So end of first year is usually kind of like the time that a lot of places would expect that to happen. So one thing you might notice about this whole process of seeking out an advisor is that it places a lot of responsibility on the student to go out and seek information, right? But as we'll see, there's not actually necessarily much guidance telling students like when and how to do those things. And that's a big part of what got us motivated to look at this in the first place, because when you've got a complicated process like this, but there's not much structure, it opens the door for systemic inequities to creep in. Because students who sort of already know how this process works, maybe because they had a parent who did a PhD or had a really, really good undergraduate advisor, they can be at this major advantage over students who are sort of trying to navigate this process on their own without much structure. Okay, so how do we go about looking into this process of how students think about finding an advisor? Well, we went out and we conducted semi-structured interviews with about 40 first and second year graduate students, not about 40, exactly 40. We chose to talk to folks who were in their first and second year, so that they were kind of either currently searching for a group or had recently joined one. We had a pretty diverse mix of students participate, which was good because we wanted to make sure we were hearing from a lot of different student perspectives. We actually had more women in our study than men, which is out of character for a lot of physics because physics has such a strong gender imbalance. And also students came from 13 different institutions, a bunch of different sizes and research output. So we got to hear from a really big mix of people. So what did we ask these people? Well, basically the first thing I asked people to do is give me a timeline of all the broad steps that they took en route to finding a research group. So these were sort of like big chunks of time, like applying to graduate school or going to visiting weekend. Then for each step, I asked people about any major questions or concerns they had at the time, right? So someone might have said, you know, while I was visiting, I really wanted to know, how do I figure out which professors are doing research that I think is interesting? Or maybe they were concerned about approaching faculty members to talk about their research, right? Like they're worried about doing that or having trouble figuring out how to do that. That was a common thing too. And then for each question, I asked, what were some of the things that really kind of helped you answer that question and what like got in your way, right? So maybe for finding out what kind of research a professor was doing, someone might have said, you know, something really helpful was talking to a grad student in the group. The grad students know everything, right? But maybe what was like really annoying is that every professor's website is super out of date. So this interview protocol was really helpful in giving insight to both what students were thinking and what they were doing, and also sort of when in their process it was happening. And that helped us get some unique insights, that temporal piece. So what did we find out? Well, a lot of things. But here we want to highlight sort of two themes that really illustrated why we felt like the group search process itself, not just that advisor-advisee relationship, but how it forms, deserves maybe some more attention from departments and researchers too. The first is that students really did recognize that this was like a really critical decision for them. They know that finding a group is important, so it should be important for us to support them in that process. Beyond that, though, we also observed several impacts that students' ability to navigate this process can have on their overall graduate experience, and we'll talk about those. Despite feeling like finding a group was really important, students discussed a number of struggles that they had with figuring out who they wanted to work with, and we'll go through some of those and talk about the implications of how we might be able to better serve graduate students. So let's talk about that first theme regarding the importance of the process. Most students viewed finding the right research group as a really significant decision, and there are a few common reasons. One, knowing that their individual relationship with their advisor would be important, maybe because of like prior research experience. So they know like I need to get this advisor decision right. So we had, for example, the student Gabriella, and these are all pseudonyms. But Gabriella said, you know, even before I started applying to graduate programs, all I heard from everyone was your relationship with your PI can make or break your career. Like everyone's telling her this. Students also saw choosing a research group as like a really long-term commitment. So that added some like stress and weight to the decision. It was something they wanted to get right. Chloe talked about this moment where she was like getting these weird feelings that her advisor was going to be kind of in charge of her life for 5 years. So that was intimidating. Folks also talked about the fact that their group would sort of impact what careers they can get. They perceive it as impacting what careers they can get. They're sort of locking themselves into a particular research path once they leave graduate school. And others expressed that they had just heard these horror stories of bad research groups that had made other students want to leave. And so they really wanted to avoid that. Across our data, those kinds of concerns, particularly those about the group's effect on persistence in the program, they were much more commonly voiced by our non-male participants. So in the study where we really dove into that, it was only a part of the sample at the time. We only analyzed 20 of our 40 students, and of that we had 11 female students. 7 of those 11 in that subset of the data talked about how they sort of had to pare down their list of prospective advisors because they were worrying that the group that they actually kind of wanted to work for wouldn't foster an inclusive environment that they felt comfortable in. Right, so this effectively limited the number of viable research options for those students, right? More than one indicated that they kind of had their eye on a research advisor that really aligned with their interests, only to have other grad students be like, oh, you really don't want to work with that group if you're a woman, right? So that's an overview of those results, and I could talk about a bunch of those even longer, but since we have lots of other things we want to talk about and we want to have time for discussion, I'm only going to really go in depth with the next major result, which was that a student's ability to navigate the group search process could really impact their sense of belonging in the program overall. In particular, we saw in our data that students who were able to join a research group with a positive environment and supportive advisor experiences this big boost in their sense of belonging, feeling like they belonged in the program. Whereas students who struggled to find a group, they started to feel more isolated from their peers, like they weren't succeeding. And those are sort of the results that we're going to highlight here. So one thing we observed was that the struggling to find a group made students feel kind of isolated, like they weren't succeeding. And part of that was because without formal guidance, students only compared their progress toward finding a group with other people in their cohort. So for instance, Dev said, you know, it's a bit stressful in the sense that for some people, before they even come here, they're fixed on an advisor. Everything's fixed. They'll go, they'll do the PhD. And so talking to those students isn't really helpful. They're not going through any of this. So they're feeling like this sort of otherness in their program. We're like, well, those people have it all figured out, but I don't. And I'm not like them. For some students, that made them feel like they weren't succeeding at all, right? Brianna said that when she saw everyone else having advisors, she was kind of freaking out because she didn't understand how people could have built that relationship so quickly. You know, it wasn't until much later in her first year when she realized a lot of people came in already knowing who they were going to work with. But before that moment, she felt like she was doing something wrong because she wasn't as far along as everyone else. And so she finally said like, oh, actually, I'm not behind. I'm not like failing at everything. But it took her a long time to sort of make that connection. Now, the first year of grad school is already hard for a variety of reasons. So for students who are already struggling with that first year, with their coursework, and they see other people in groups, maybe they even get rejected from a group or two themselves because of funding or whatever. What we saw is that feeling of failure can really start to accrue, right? Like Brianna later said that after she'd been told by several advisors that they didn't have funding, she said, personally, I thought I was cursed. Like I'd slighted the department in some way, like I'd offended someone, like I was being blacklisted from advisors. It was like, I guess I'm not supposed to be here because everything's making it seem like it's not working out, right? On the other hand, we saw that students who were able to embed themselves in a positive research group during their first year felt this increased sense of community. So Nathan was a theorist. So in physics, it's sort of one of the subfields of physics you can go into as sort of more theoretical physics. He was a theorist who joined a group early in his first year. And for the first time in his life, he was sort of not doing well in coursework and he was feeling really isolated in the department. He said, last semester was a whole mess for me with one of the classes, with StatMech. It wasn't exciting to me. And then this other class, the professor taught it really horribly. And so that's when it was sort of muddled again with like, is this a me and physics thing? So Nick was actually starting to question like, well, do I even like physics anymore because of this in-class experience? At one point, he even considered leaving the program. He said, I expressed to my advisor, I might not even stay. I might leave after a master's. But being in a group and doing the research was sort of the thing keeping him in graduate school. He said, doing research felt really good and independent. I'm still interested in physics. There's still lots to do. The whole portion that I get very excited about, that's the whole portion I still get very excited about. My advisor also wants me to stay in the group and keep doing the work, which is nice to hear. So this is a student whose advisor is saying that he's doing great research in this theoretical cosmology lab, but who's seriously considering leaving because he wasn't doing well in classes and just feeling like he wasn't at home in the overall department. Doing the research work was the thing that he was actually interested in and what was trying to kind of keeping him there, right? So we saw how joining a group early can sort of help support community. We saw some other benefits that students felt finding a group early sort of offered them, right? For one, we saw some lowered sense of stress over needing to find a group among the students who were sort of able to find a group quickly. So Luis, who joined a group in his first semester, was like, I felt so relieved my whole first year because I didn't have to go out and find a group like everyone else did, you know? We also saw examples of students who said getting into research early was actually helping them get through their program more quickly, right? Heather joined a group her first semester and said, if I hadn't been in my advisor's group as a first year and kind of set on that path, I wouldn't have had the resources or the knowledge ready to take my qualifying exam that early. And her qualifying exam was sort of based on having a research proposal. So her being in a group early helped her take her qualifying exam earlier, and that let her apply for a grant earlier that she had to have her qualifying done for. So it was sort of putting her ahead of several other students in her cohort, or she felt like it was putting her ahead of students in her cohort because she reached candidacy before them. Overall, students felt like there were a number of benefits offered by being able to get into a research lab quickly. Even if someone joined a group their first year and it wasn't the one they ended up staying in, at least it let them get to try some research. And if they didn't like it, they could switch out and not feel as behind. So here, I'm going to give you a spoiler of a couple of results from a second paper we wrote on this topic. A lot of what I've talked about so far is from the first, which looked at factors that tended to influence when students joined a research group. And I hope maybe this will spur some discussion later on too. Basically, we saw that the level of certainty that students had about the research they wanted to pursue was related to when they joined, which maybe isn't terribly surprising. For instance, we had one student, Callie, who said, upon entering graduate school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I came in not knowing anything. I just wanted to explore. So students like Callie, who talked about having such broad ranges of interest, kind of took a little longer to find a group. They did explore, right? On the other end of the spectrum were students who described sort of knowing exactly what research they wanted to do. And a lot of times those students had an advisor sort of lined up before they even got to grad school. So for instance, Heather said she was going to keep doing machine learning supernova research because that was the only thing keeping me in physics and astronomy. She said if she couldn't do that with the person she wanted, she would just leave. Like, it's heart set on this one thing. So there's wildly different students coming into graduate school with wildly different expectations, which on its own is important for departments to recognize that students are coming in with these majorly different expectations. Then taking a step back for a minute, one firmly established result in education literature is that certainty of interest is strongly linked to undergraduate experiences, like undergraduate research. You're more likely to want to do things that you're familiar with. And those undergraduate experiences also help when it comes to having a network of faculty and grad students that you can ask about and helping you narrow down your search for a lab. But it's also known that not everyone gets to do lots of research or take advanced coursework, right? That's known in the literature, and we saw it in our data. Carmen said, I'm a first-generation student, and I struggled with my course load. I applied to RU programs over the summer. This was when he was an undergrad. I didn't get any offers. So Carmen talked about how he came into grad school with fairly broad research interests because he hadn't done a whole lot of research. And he actually said he never really felt like he had access to as many resources as a lot of his peers. Contrast that experience with Alex, whose father had a PhD in STEM, was doing an RU his junior year at the graduate school he wanted to attend. He said, yeah, while I was doing my RU, I met with the chair of the physics department. I said, I really want to come here. As an RU student, the doors just kind of open for you. So Alex was one of the students with like really narrow interests and joined a group before he even got to grad school. He joined the summer before. And so whereas Carmen felt like he didn't have a lot of the connections to rely on, Alex was meeting with the chair of the prospective department because of the access he got from his RU program. So now let's connect a bunch of these results. We saw how finding a group early on helped alleviate a lot of concerns that people had with things like funding and anxiety over their search, and tended to provide more sense of belonging in their program. What helped students with getting into a group early were formative experiences like undergraduate research and having a strong mentor. Those were really impactful for shaping students' interests and their overall network of faculty and grad students available to help them with the process. Except a lot of prior literature, plus some of our own data, indicates that access to those opportunities are linked to a student's background and aren't equally distributed, right? We saw that on the last slide with Carmen and Alex. Obviously, it's important to provide all students with the structure and support they need in graduate school, but it's really extra important for those students who maybe didn't do a lot of undergrad research, aren't exactly sure what they want to do. So it's important for departments to do a good job of facilitating their group search so that they don't start to get that sense of isolation like the folks in our data describe, like they're not succeeding. Unfortunately, though, a lot of times that structure and support students described as not really being there. And that's a major part of the second theme of this paper, the difficulties that students had finding a group. So number one was that students wanted more structure. That included things like more explicit ways to connect with faculty and other graduate students, more explicit policies and guidelines for how finding a research group is supposed to work, when it's supposed to happen. A lot of that was sort of hidden, they felt like. Another part of the group search process that we saw students struggling with was sort of a personal feeling of unpreparedness to make this decision. Like they weren't equipped to totally understand what kind of research was happening, right? Like the research that was happening was too advanced, too complicated to sort of get a handle on what it actually was. And also that some didn't really have expectations for what working in a group would look like. So a couple of folks joined a group, ended up switching out because they weren't happy in their first group. And they said, well, I figured grad school was supposed to be hard, but it's probably normal to be miserable. But then after switching, they're like, oh, I didn't have to be that miserable at all. I'm actually not so much going to talk about that branch of results. And instead, I'm going to focus on this middle part and a third pillar that was all about students feeling like their coursework and their research were sort of in tension. Classes tended to make students feel like they didn't have enough time to evaluate and explore possible research opportunities. And coursework also contributed to this feeling like the student's role in the group search process wasn't clear. Okay, and in the end, both of those are related to that lack of structure and guidance, as we'll see in a moment. So those will be the main focus of the next couple slides. So like I said, underlying a lot of the difficulties that students talked about was the feeling that there wasn't enough structure in guiding their group search process. Some of the descriptions for this included, there's no guidelines. The department hasn't done a good job at facilitating ways to learn about groups. Once you get here, you kind of have to fend for yourself. Actually, two different students used the phrase fend for yourself to describe the whole group search process. And then I was a little confused about what my role was supposed to be in looking to join groups, right? As one example of the sort of ambiguous guidelines, we went and looked at sort of the graduate handbooks for the schools in our samples to see what they had to say about finding an advisor. As it turns out, they don't actually say much. So this is in the context of physics, remember. One of the 13 sort of physics graduate handbooks gave a formal requirement that said students have to have a research group by this particular time, and that the advisor and the advisee would actually sign like an agreement to that effect that they were a pair. 6 of the 13 gave typical timelines for finding an advisor, although that typical varied anywhere between like first year spring semester to like the third year. So that's some guidance, but 5 didn't mention it at all. The whole process of finding a research group was sort of implicit in the requirements for passing a qualifying exam and beginning research. However, every single handbook had a really prominent section on coursework. This one even got its own dedicated section. And a lot of the websites are really similar. So if you're a student coming in and not quite sure what your role is supposed to be in this process, you might be forgiven for really prioritizing classes during the first year. I mean, after all, passing classes in undergrad was always like the main goal, so why would grad school be any different, right? But there's some issues with that mixed messaging. So first off, we saw earlier in Nathan's case that classes weren't sort of the thing that was being cited as much as providing this source of community. Rather, students were more often citing classes as sort of this hindrance to finding their group and starting research. That dynamic was pretty well summed up by Brianna, who said one major source of confusion during her first year was whether or not I had to find a group right away, as opposed to waiting out and focusing on trying to pass these hard courses first. She said, I feel like doing all that was a little stressful, and I was under the impression that I'd get a little bit more advising help how to navigate graduate school. And like I said, I really just had to kind of figure it out on my own. The tension students felt between classes and finding a group is illustrated quite succinctly by the next student, who gave one of my favorite quotes, although I suspect it might not hit quite as hard in the context of this community because it's so physics-based. But we had a student, Isaac, said, friends would ask me sometimes, have you found a research group? And I'd be like, no, I haven't even thought about it. I'm trying to figure out the electric field of a charged hemisphere. And I promise when I give this talk for a bunch of physicists, they think that's funny. The reason being that the task of finding the electric field for a thing is this really common problem that physics graduate students do in class, but that everyone kind of knows is a very artificial situation, and it's very disconnected from research and the real world. So Isaac's pointing out that he's spending all this time doing something that he thinks is kind of useless and isn't helping him, but he's spending a lot of time doing it. The point is that the emphasis for students throughout their sort of entire academic careers is coursework. So when they hit graduate school, that's of course the thing that they're going to prioritize in their first year, even though there's this really impactful decision coming up that they might have to make, or that they do have to make, about who they're going to work with. Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways from this difficulty section that students described? Struggling made people feel like they were falling behind, and sort of that be falling behind their peers or failing, which, as we saw in the first part of the talk, really contributed to those feelings of isolation, which ultimately contributed to 9 of the students in our sample of 40. They said they thought about leaving, right? These are the students that were still there. We talked to first and second year students. We aren't able to talk to the students who actually did leave. These are the students who thought about it. Next, we observed that a lot of the difficulties that folks described regarding a lack of time due to coursework or wanting more guidance or lacking expectations were more of a challenge for the students who are trying to figure out those things during graduate school. So there's a lot to balance in that first year. So you can imagine that maybe someone like Alex, a student who had sort of already found a group during his RU, and he had talked to a bunch of faculty before he even got there, he didn't have to deal with all those things in the midst of trying to do coursework and teaching. So in terms of allocation of time, he had already done all that stuff. So overall, students indicate that the current structures tend to disadvantage those students who don't already have the sort of initial connection or a strong interest in a group that lets them sort of expedite this whole search process. Or just who might not know how to play the game of graduate school. There's a lot of unwritten rules of when to do classes, when to look for an advisor, what to ask, how funding works. And we know that doesn't describe every student ever, right? But this is sort of meant to give departments a way to start to understand a little bit more about the dynamics of why students might feel like they're struggling and why some students might leave. And so I'll really briefly mention some ideas to hopefully encourage discussion around ways departments might be able to better accommodate students. I'll admit we don't have all the answers, right? But what we want to do is get folks thinking about some structural elements that could be used to better support students. And what we tried to do is organize some of these kind of roughly according to level of effort they might require from folks in the department. So at the lower end, things like just clarifying expectations to find group on websites and handbooks is one thing. That's a case of updating current material. Speaking of websites, updating faculty and department websites really helps students because a lot of the time that's their first point of contact for looking at grad schools and prospective advisors, especially for students who don't have a sort of inside connection to the school. We had one student from a small liberal arts college who said, I don't have an advisor here that I can go talk to, and they can call up someone at another school and they can point me in the right direction. So I'm just looking at websites, but they're all 10 years out of date. Another thing, individual development plans are documents that students make that outline their goals sort of in the short term and the long term, and then sort of with a faculty advisor, they go through and describe exactly what does the student need to do to reach those goals and when. So it's one way to add structure. There's some discipline specific ones. Chemistry has an IDP specifically for their discipline, but there's more broad ones that can be adapted. Providing more chances to interact with faculty and other students, like peer mentorship programs, social events, days dedicated to touring labs, meeting advisors. Those are sort of mid-tier efforts, but then on the sort of major reform scale, thinking about how to maybe build the group search into the curriculum in a meaningful way, spreading courses over a longer period of time, or putting in a course specifically dedicated to giving students time to explore and work with research groups. And last, a lot of sciences, like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, do a formalized rotation system of bringing students through labs. There's some research on rotations already regarding some of the students' difficulties with those. Like, that's not a perfect solution either. But one of the things that students do like about them is that it lets them explore their options and get some insight into lab culture earlier on. There's not really an analogous structure in physics, but maybe there could be. That's it. Thanks everyone for listening. If you want to talk more, feel free to send me an email. These are the two papers, the links to the two papers that I talked about before. And I think now it's time to open it up for questions for either me or co-author Ben Zwickl, who's also here, as Pranoti said. So, and I know that I have to not stop sharing. I have to just let someone else take control. So I don't think I do anything.
Yep, we got it.
Okay,
so
good.
Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, Mike, one question came in from a graduate student. And I don't know if you see it there in the chat, but the student's currently in the process of searching for a PhD position. And most universities, it sounds like in geosciences, are recommending contacting potential advisors even before applying. So question one is, would it save some stress to get an advisor early? And then second, is this idea about, contacting a supervisor early or a prospective supervisor early, is that kind of a field dependent thing? Do we have any sense on how that varies between disciplines?
So for the first bit, I would say certainly in our data that was reflected that folks who got into an advising relationship earlier on tended to feel less stressed out about the first year. They could focus on other things and they could start doing research. It also gave them sort of an emergency outlet almost, like if they got there the first year and were like, oh, actually, this really isn't for me, they didn't feel as behind. So like if they switched out, like I had switched research group myself about a year and a half into my PhD, and one of the feelings was like, man, this is like I feel like I'm kind of behind. That fear is really kind of unfounded. Like the PhD is a really long process, right? Like whether you switch 6 months into your PhD or a year and a half into your PhD, it's not that big a deal. But that's a real fear that people have, like, man, I'm falling behind.
Although that being said, I mean, on a personal note, it took you maybe a year and a half to realize you wanted to make the switch, because how early did you join that lab? Like,
oh no, end of my first year, right? I mean, yeah, because I didn't know what I was doing. I was one of the broad interest people, didn't know sort of what to look for. Yeah. So yeah, it took me a while to get into that lab in the first place. And there's something else I wanted to say about. Oh, the other piece of data that was the one thing the students who did get into a lab early, if there was a source of stress, it was that exactly, like that they got in, they weren't happy, and so they faced this sort of stressful decision, like, man, do I leave? Do I stay? What do I do? Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I don't have as strong an answer to the second one. I don't think as far as across disciplines. Ben, do you know of any?
I don't have any actual data there, but I would say that, the degree to which a lot of graduate programs look at prior research experience as a strongly looked for piece of the application. Like any undergraduate research is likely to build this network and kind of help you kind of pre-identify, have some insider info into what's happening at different graduate programs. And so, I mean, I think there's something that's probably kind of universal across, science for that. But, it is actually interesting to hear that a lot of geoscience programs are explicitly telling students to do that before applying. So it looks like we got a couple questions. I think Eva was first.
Yeah, thank you. This is awesome, and I really appreciate that you structured it in a way where the onus is on the department to provide more clarity and guidance. I'm wondering though, like for those of us who do interface with potential students or students in that time before they're on campus, like if you have any advice on how we can better guide them either on like how to sort of suss out a research group or where maybe we could find resources on that.
Yeah, so that was actually in the first paper that's linked there. The suggestions for things was we actually sort of broke it down according to, like, here are things the department could do, but kind of knowing that could be kind of a long structural change process, and might not happen right away. We have like another section, sort of like, what can you do as a student, if you're sort of trying to navigate this process. And I think some of the big things that students talked about were things that they wish they had known going in, or that they found really helpful at some point, were getting in touch with other graduate students. Like, instead of just, you know, talking to the advisor, the grad students, everyone says, like, they're the ones that will tell you what it's like on the day-to-day to work in the lab. What do I actually do, like, when I'm here? Talking about work-life balance of, you know, with the advisor and their expectations and things. Those were all details that folks didn't tend to think of as much, but found it really helpful. And another thing, I mean, I think I would say one thing that we almost every student said was what was important to them sort of shifted over time. So before they got to graduate school, all they were sort of looking for was research. What's going to match my interests? But by the time they got there and sort of saw what's available, what's not, the thing that became more important was finding a group that they felt comfortable in, that the culture was good, that they felt like would be able to sustain them over a long period of time. And that sort of became more important. So recognizing that, I think, earlier can help too, because it sort of maybe opens up the fields of, like, okay, maybe this isn't like the exact perfect research that I have in my head, but it's a much better fit for me. So trying to reflect on, like, what's the kind of environment that would be able to sustain me over, you know, a long period of time. Those are my thoughts. I don't know if you have
so
others.
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it seems like anything, you know, at least once you're in the grad program, where you can kind of foster graduate student communities, so you have students that have been in the program interacting with students who are new in the program, that's really valuable, even though most faculty's default is to say, like, hey, let's do a grad seminar where, like, you know, you'll have faculty cycle through into a classroom rather than students getting to go into a lab. So, you know, there's some things like that where just grad student community, or maybe like a poster, like a poster event where students, you know, present research to each other. And so, you know, like, as a new student, you could actually get to meet the students who are doing the research, not just the faculty member who's doing the research. So stuff like that, you know, were a few of the suggestions along the lines of what Mike was talking about. Yeah, I think Pranati, you were next.
Yeah, this is really terrific. My question actually has to do with your research. The institutions that you chose, I think you said you had 13 departments that you were looking at. Did the type of institution sort of matter? You know, was it like a state university that had a doctoral program versus a, you know, R1 or something like that? And also the students that stayed, you know, after the first 2 years, was it connected in any way to the size of the group? You know, well, did you study that, or is that something you can speak to? Thank you.
Yeah, a little bit. So regarding the institution, as far as like size and stuff, we didn't look too much into correlations of, like, oh, these bigger schools, smaller schools. But what we did see is variation across specific policies that some places had. Two things. One, I would say one of the schools had an explicit, like, rotation program that students went through, and it was a smaller program, and all the students that we talked to thought that was really valuable. They thought it was sort of, actually several of them said, like, oh, I went in and I had my first choice of who I was going to work with, and I worked with them and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing this, and then rotated through a different lab and they're like, oh, this is much more aligned with what I'd like to do, and who I'd like to work with. That was really the more important thing. So some structure there, certainly people said was helpful. others that had things like guaranteed funding in their summer. So one of the schools said, we're going to give you guaranteed funding through the summer, work with whoever you want. And people thought that was really helpful because it felt like they weren't sort of hooked to their advisor in a way, like it was just part of the program, whereas other students that start working for someone feel like this sense of attachment, like I owe them something, like they're paying me, so they're sort of, you know, it makes it harder to switch, whereas that was something that people felt like helped. As far as other things, some students had perceptions certainly about like how some schools were admitting students, in terms of feeling like they were over admitting students who wanted to do certain research, and so they felt like there was too much competition, that like everyone wants to do theoretical astrophysics, so they felt like there was too much competition. We can't speak to actually if that's like the case, but students at least felt like it. Like they're like, there's only one astrophysicist that has funding, but there's 7 of us that want to work with him, so it seems like the department should have done a better job there. But yeah, those are sort of some of the more institutional specific things that I can remember.
Yeah, there might be a little bit of a difference between some of the smaller PhD programs and bigger ones, where smaller ones might tend, just because they're worried more about like funding and supporting students, just kind of matching students earlier on in the process, almost from the admit phase, like tentative matchings to know that there's a likely fundable opportunity for the student, whereas the bigger programs do just admit a cohort. You know, there's some fraction of the students accept the offer, and then you hope it all works out, you know, and that's much more kind of wide open. Yeah, I think Leela was next.
Yeah, I just had a real quick question for you. In your research, did you sit down and talk with any faculty members to get their perspective on how students are searching for and how they're doing that process of accepting students in or finding students for their research, just to kind of get the other side to see maybe where some of those structural gaps from both sides are? Or is that something that you plan to be doing in the future?
Yeah, so we didn't. That is something we would love to do, is to sort of get the other side of how do you think this process unfolds? How do you expect it to? Maybe would be a good way to phrase it, is sort of what a faculty think is going on, what a students think is going on, and seeing the extent to which those match essentially. But no, we didn't. That's definitely, we've talked about it and is a thing that we would like to do at some point.
Thanks. Sounds like a good future add-on to your research.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we've bounced around a few different other ideas for extending this, and that's definitely one of them.
Yeah, and I mean, I hear the tension in faculties, the way they talk about it. Like, you know, there are faculty that are like, oh yeah, we really want to admit students that can come in without knowing what they want to do and explore and find their opportunity. Like, I've heard many faculty say stuff like that, you know, in response to kind of our research. And then at the same time, there is like so much early matching that happens for students that, you know, did undergraduate research, get coupled through an REU, or maybe an advisor at their home institution connects them to an advisor at their future institution, and like all of the benefits that confers. And obviously that's a good thing too, but it's not equitable in terms of who gets access. And so yeah, there's a lot of, I think, tension in just the system and just how faculty even think about it. So it would be fun to look at.
I mean, yeah, informally, some of the feedback just from doing talks and things is just that it is really, it's difficult, just because of the limitations of who has funding and who doesn't. And I mean, so trying to, one of the things we discussed is what students make of, you know, when a faculty member says they don't have funding, right? Like, students, like, we had examples of students saying, like, does that really mean they don't have funding, or are they just, is that just like a soft way of like denying me their group, and they're just, you know, kind of not telling me, no, we don't want you. And so faculty, you know, are like, a lot of times they're like, actually, I don't have funding. I really genuinely don't, but I don't want you to take that the wrong way. Like, there's a miscommunication there.
Yeah, well, there's also, I think, a power imbalance and like no clear
Yeah.
communication structure. So it's like when a faculty member says, I don't have funding, they don't have to pull up like grant spreadsheets and prove that they actually don't. They can just be like, well, you know, I'd rather not spend the money I have on you, could be the message. On the other hand, you know, I've definitely heard faculty say, like in respect to a student they really want, yeah, we'll find a way to make it work. You know, and there's even some students went through experiences like that in the data set. And sometimes faculty find a way to make it work. And so it's like, what's the difference between finding a way to make it work and like, you know, like this soft no, like, you know, where I just use funding as the out to kind of get rid of any students I don't want to talk to. Yeah, there's no transparency in terms of like what funding actually is available. So the student's entirely left up to kind of whatever the faculty member says. So that's and I think that's kind of unfortunate, and not fair. So
in addition to the papers that are listed here on this slide, there's also one other sort of a cheat sheet, if you will, that has some of the highlights and the summaries from today's webinar, sort of based on the papers. So it's a good handout that you can, you know, like take to your department chair, but if you're a grad student, you can also use it to, you know, share with your peers. So I think it's sort of a two-sided sort of document, if you will, you know, for both parties. So feel free to download that. Then maybe Leela, we could finish off. Yeah, thanks. So anyway, for those of you who are here, you will get a link, email and a link to the recording. So please feel free to share this with other colleagues if you're interested. If you are a department chair and you're interested in asking our presenters any additional questions, you can feel free to email me or write to me. If your department chair would like to join the heads and chairs community, we can certainly have you be part of that. If you're interested in being at our in-person workshop at the AGU annual meeting, we can add you to the list. And if you could go to the last slide, we have our next webinar is on April 4th, and we're going to talk about how you can sort of jumpstart your broader impacts for your projects. So if you're interested, please join us for that webinar. And if you've missed any previous webinars from earlier this year or from previous years, you can certainly catch them on the webinars link posted over here. So thank you very much to all our speakers. This was really informative and a really terrific discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Bye-bye.